Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Susan Hillier, and I'm the Dean for Research here at the University of South Australia. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I think most of us, we're meeting on the lands of the Kaurna people, and that we would like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge the ongoing connection to country. I'm really delighted today to, this is our first of the UniSA ABMC talks, and two pretty inspiring people. Pretty and inspiring, that would be very gendered, so I won't say it like that. I'll just say that they're just super inspiring people that I've had the privilege of watching their careers for quite a few years now, so it's great that they're here to talk with us. And the first of our speakers is Dr. Ashley Smith. Ash has a neurophysiology background, and she's now a senior lecturer with us in exercise physiology, but brings a really strong foundation in understanding how the brain works. And this is combined now with one of the interests in our academic unit, which is allied health and human performance, where she's using her really strong neuroscience background and applying it for a really major challenge for our society, which is the best ways to prevent and manage dementia, particularly using activity. So thanks, Ash. I'll pass over to you, and I'll go off screen and I'll appear when we get close to the time. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks, Susan. I'd also like to extend thanks to SAMRI and the Biomeg City team for the opportunity to present some of our work today. So the work I'm going to talk about today is currently funded by an NHMRC Boosting Dementia Research Initiative Priority Round 5 grant and also the Hospital Research Foundation. So we know that dementia is a clustering of over 100 different neurodegenerative diseases, and these affect learning, memory, and behaviour. Dementia is progressive in nature, which means it progressively gets worse at different rates for different people, and there's currently no cure. So a recent statistic released by Alzheimer's UK indicated that without a significant medical advancement, approximately 1/3 of all children born in the UK in 2015 will be facing a dementia diagnosis within their lifetime. So in order to put this into context, this statistic suggests that 2 of the 6 children on the slide will at some point in their life be diagnosed with dementia. So in Australia alone, we have about 500,000 people living with dementia, and this number is projected to increase to over 1 million people by 2050. So what you might not know, though, is that apart from age and genetic factors, there are a number of modifiable lifestyle factors that can reduce dementia risk and may even delay dementia diagnosis beyond the point of someone's natural life. So in 2020, the Lancet Commission, led by UCL Professor Jill Livingston, identified many different risk factors that contribute to dementia risk across the lifespan. So the results of the Lancet Commission were presented in this figure, which is often shown in dementia conferences. So in grey, you can see the non-modifiable factors. These are things such as age and genetics. So just being older increases your risk of dementia. But there's also a number of modifiable factors that we should watch out for. So in early life, just less education, so lower educational attainment can increase your risk of dementia in later life. In midlife, factors such as obesity, hypertension and hearing loss seem to convey increased risk of dementia in late life. And then by the time we get to our 60s and older, factors such as smoking, depression, social isolation, diabetes and physical inactivity seem to convey the biggest risk for late life dementia. So traditionally, physical activity was explored as a univariate variable with very little consideration that actually each and every day, no matter who you are, only ever has 24 hours in it. So this means that in order to increase time spent being physically active, equal time must be taken away from either sleeping or sitting. So over the last 5 years, our group, led by Professor Tim Olds and other behavioural epidemiologists, have begun to reconsider just looking at physical activity on its own, and have started to view it as a single component of the 24-hour day. And we call this time use composition. So how we spend time in any given day can be good or it can be bad for our health. But in the dementia prevention space, we're really lacking sufficiently large data sets which enabled us to explore the influence of time use on cognition and dementia risk. We also know that diet too can be explored as a composition, except instead of time, for diet, we look at trade-offs between different foods and different food groups. So based on these knowledge gaps, the Activate study was designed to generate a world-first data set in which we recruited 450 older adults, so 60 to 70-year-olds, and we're tracking diet, time use, cognition, and a number of other brain health measures every 18 months for 3 years. So the primary aim of Activate is to use a compositional data analysis technique. This is a technique that was actually developed in the study of rock composition. So people in geology like to know the composition of their rocks so they can have a look at how much gold is in their rocks, for example. So we took that approach and we're now applying it to health behaviours. So specifically, we're looking at applying iterative analyses of time use and diet compositions, which will enable us to identify the best days and the best diets for dementia prevention. And then following some extra funding from the Hospital Research Foundation, we're going to change these complex statistical models into an interactive tool. So we'll co-design this tool with older adults, and we'll use the tool to estimate the predicted change in cognition when people change different aspects of time use or diet. So at the start of 2020, we've successfully recruited 226 participants in Adelaide and 2022, sorry, and 200 participants at our second site in Newcastle. And we've just recently begun the 18-month visits. So these data are based off of our pilot data. So in our pilot data, we showed that daily time use predicts cognition on a general cognitive assessment, which is called the Addenbrooke's cognitive exam. The way that you interpret this graph is on the x-axis, we've got proportion of the day spent in physical activity from low to high. On this y-axis, we've got proportion of the day spent in sedentary behaviour from low to high. And then on this z-axis, we've got proportion of the day spent in sleep. And so we can overlay the variable that we're interested in. In this case, it's cognition, and we've color-coded this cognition variable into low blue or high red. And what you can see is that gradient shift from low to high really follows that physical activity axis. So we've begun to look at this in more depth using the Activate data set, and my PhD student, Madison Mello, has extended these analyses by analysing the first 347 Activate participants. Her analyses show that it seems to be time spent in moderate to vigorous physical activity at the equal expense of the other daily behaviours, which are associated with better processing speed, whereas actually getting more sleep at the expense of other behaviours was associated with poorer memory. And so we're just, Maddie's now using the full cross-sectional Activate data set to begin to disentangle these relationships a little bit more. So the other hot of the press analyses that we've begun to play around with using just the cross-sectional data from Activate is we're not only considering the duration of daily activities, but we're also starting to explore in more depth the different contexts of activities that people engage in every day. So using a time use recall tool called the Multimedia Recall Tool for Children and Adults, or the marker, we asked each of our Activate participants to rate their perceived mental effort of every day, every activity they did over a 48 period. So data from the first 259 participants are included in this figure here. And this also incorporates 17,433 activity instances. So from these data, we can see that mean perceived mental effort, which is on our y-axis, was highest for activities that fell under the super domain of work. And then that progressively got lower until the lowest activities were sleeping and self-care. So from an interpretation standpoint, it seems that it's not only important to consider total activity duration, but also the context of different activities and perhaps even the perceived mental effort of these activities. And when we do this, we'll get a better, more holistic understanding of dementia prevention. So as I wrap up, this 8-minute chat about the Activate study, I would just like to thank all of the Activate collaborators, both old and new. And I guess in terms of our study, our next steps will be to continue recruiting the 18-month data, as well as the 3-year time point, and then also to explore that tool that we're developing as well in terms of usability and acceptability. So it's me done.
Great, thanks very much, Ash, and perfectly timed. So we have time for some questions. So if you want to post them in the Q&A chat. So Paul Reynolds is asking, doesn't this just show associations, not cause and effect?
Yeah, so cross-sectional data at this time point. So, yep, certainly just associations at the moment. Once we are able to capture the 18-month time point and then also the 3-year time point, we'll be able to actually map linear changes as well as non-linear changes in cognition across the 3 time points.
Great. Any other questions? I've got just one about the hearing loss. This is perfectly self-interested. So that lovely graph, that lovely graphic that you had before about the modifiable, is that just an association that there's something about degenerative hearing loss that is, you know, goes along with it, like I said, maybe a pre-morbid dementia, or is it actually, what's the relationship there?
It's a good point, Susan. I think we're still really trying to understand that relationship. Interestingly, it seems people who are born profoundly deaf don't necessarily have an increased risk of dementia.
Right.
So I guess it's we're still trying to work out whether it's perhaps a social engagement factor or whether there's other factors associated with that hearing loss.
Okay.
Hannah, did you want to jump in and say anything on that as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, like most annoying science answers, it's probably a bit of everything. But definitely people who have hearing impairments tend to engage less in social activities, which, you know, social engagement's protective against dementia, but also social activities are quite cognitively taxing, and we know that cognitive engagement's also protective against dementia. So I think they're big driving factors, the lack of, essentially decreasing social and cognitive engagement,
Okay.
and increasing isolation.
Right, I won't get too worried then and go.
There's lots of randomized controlled trials about hearing aids. I think the one thing is that wear hearing aids if you have a hearing impairment.
Okay. Well, I am asking for a friend actually who is about my age, who's just had cochlear implants, which is rather scary actually for someone as young as I don't know. Anyway, look, that's I think that's all we have for questions. And so we'll move on to you, Hannah. So Ash, if you can stop sharing your screen. And now I'll introduce Hannah Keage, who is in also at UniSA, in a different academic unit. She's in Justice and Society, however, collaborates a lot across. She's also a member of CANE, the Cognitive Aging and Impairment Neurosciences Laboratory, out at McGill. Hannah's background is actually in psychology and cognitive neuroscience, and she's particularly interested in these things, as you can probably tell already, around the influence of aging on cognition, and in particular interested in the clinical manifestations of delirium, as well as dementia. And she's an associate professor in psychology with us. So welcome, Hannah. And I'll now disappear and leave the stage to you.
Thank you, Susan. And thanks so much for the invitation to present today. It's really great to be invited to share our research. Also, happy International Women's Day to everyone out there. A really exciting day to be here with Susan and Ash doing this seminar. So yes, my primary interest is cognitive aging and the role of sort of cognitive impairments that are common in late life, in essentially the progression of cognitive aging. So today I'm going to be talking about progression from delirium to dementia. So most people are quite familiar with dementia. And luckily for me, Ash has sort of touched on sort of the basic characteristics. So dementia is more common in late life than it is in early life. It's chronic and it's progressive, and it's characterized by impairments in cognition and in function. People generally aren't as familiar with delirium. So I thought I'd sort of define my terms first. So there are certainly overlaps with dementia. For example, it is more common to develop delirium in late life than early life. So we see a lot of older adults with delirium, but not as many children. Unlike dementia, however, is precipitated by an acute insult. And these acute insults are typically surgeries or procedures or, a systemic infection. It's also acute in its presentation, which is very dissimilar to dementia. So someone can be fine at 10 a.m., but at 2 p.m. they might have a severe delirium and, be unresponsive, essentially, unrousable and unable to, conduct a coherent conversation. It's also fluctuating, and it typically lasts sort of hours to days, unlike dementia, which is, chronic and progressive. And it's characterized by a disturbance of attention and arousal. And we see different subtypes. For example, hypoarousal, where someone's very difficult, it's very hard to rouse someone and have a conversation, through to hyperactive delirium, where people can be quite agitated, hyperactive, lots of talking, and sometimes delusions and hallucinations. So delirium is really, really important because it's essentially associated with every poor outcome you could ever imagine in an older person. So it's associated with high rates of mortality. It's estimated to account for nearly 1,000 deaths in Australia a year. It's associated with increased rates of institutionalization, frailty, much longer hospital stays, distress, and that's distress for the patient and also the family, and as well as the caregivers in some instances too. And it's also associated with increased rates of incident cognitive impairment and dementia. And it costs about $9 billion a year here in Australia. There are some recent quality care standards that I've put the image up here. If you're interested, they're worth downloading. So I thought I'd just go through some of the work we've been doing over the last 10 years to really look at this relationship of delirium progressing to dementia or progressing to a sort of a severe cognitive decline. These are two earlier papers that I was involved with. The first demonstrated that delirium is associated with an increased risk of incident dementia, so about a 9-fold increase. The second paper showed that delirium is associated with an increased rate of cognitive decline in late life. Now, these two papers were using population-based autopsy samples. We had nearly 1,000 people represented in one of the papers. And really interestingly, these effects didn't appear to be driven by standard dementia-related neuropathologies. We've been doing a lot of work over the last few years, especially a lot of meta-analyses during the global pandemic. It's been great to have some ability to synthesize the current state of play while we couldn't be collecting a huge amount of data. So we've done a huge amount of work synthesizing essentially the incidence of delirium in certain groups. And we're particularly focused on older cardiac patients, so especially coronary artery bypass grafting and TAVI, transaortic valve implantation. And what we've found across all of our meta-analyses is that around a quarter of older adults experience delirium in hospital after these surgeries or procedures. And this rate of about 25% is mirrored in lots of other patient groups in other meta-analyses that are published. So it's really common and it's associated with all of these poor outcomes. A really lovely study published last year by colleagues in England demonstrated that it's really delirium itself that's driving this progression into dementia and cognitive decline. In the past, the past decade or two, it was thought that hospitalisation drove that association. So an older person who was admitted to hospital had an increased rate of cognitive decline and dementia. Really elegantly, this group embedded a study within an existing cohort. So they fortunately had baseline cognitive ability and dementia, and they followed older adults in Newcastle in England for a year. And what they essentially, they tracked everyone who was admitted to hospital. They measured delirium daily. And essentially after this sort of enormous study over a year, they sort of essentially formed 3 groups. I mean, one group was about 40% of the sample over 60 were admitted to hospital at least once over the course of that year. So there was, of course, 60% of people who never entered hospital. There was a group that entered hospital at least once but never experienced delirium. And then there was a group that was admitted to hospital at least once and at some point had a delirium diagnosis across their admission or one of their admissions. And what they found is that it was only this group who was hospitalised and experienced delirium that had an increased rate of cognitive decline and dementia. So it's really delirium that's driving cognitive decline and dementia, not hospitalisation. So why is delirium interesting in the context of dementia for us? Well, first of all, that it does really appear that delirium is driving the progression to dementia. Interestingly, delirium is actually partly preventable through a multi-component intervention sort of framework approach. And there's a Cochrane review synthesizing that research. So delirium actually may be a modifiable risk factor for dementia. However, these multi-component interventions, I mean, they're quite simplistic at the surface level. They're about early mobilization, hearing aids and glasses, making sure someone's hydrated, that they're sleeping, that they're cognitively and socially engaged. They're actually incredibly labor intensive. So we need to identify those at high risk to target these high cost interventions. So in our own group, what we're looking to do is identify those at high risk for delirium using pre-procedural factors and neurophysiological data. So that's about identifying those at high risk so we can target interventions. We're also assessing interventions to prevent delirium and cognitive decline. We're determining ways to differentiate delirium from dementia when people are presenting for the first time into acute care and we don't know necessarily their history like they did in that cohort study. And we're also trying to understand the neural mechanisms underlying delirium and risk for delirium. So that's the whirlwind 8-minute tour of progression from delirium to dementia. I'd like to thank the whole team because science is a massive team effort. And please get in touch if you've got any questions or you'd like to collaborate on any delirium studies. We're always keen to pursue more delirium research.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Hannah. That's fantastic work. It's always reminds me of, you know, when it's a very long time ago that I worked in acute care, but, you know, and even back then, you know, we would very aggressively get people out of bed, you know, particularly, we used to call them the off-and-offs, which is, we wouldn't get away with saying that now, but with the, you know, the older folk coming in with their, you know, fractured necks of femur and having a internal fixation, and then we would get them up pretty much no matter how drowsy they were. So it's interesting that, you know, there's no evidence. Well, when we, you know, we obviously thought we were doing the right thing, but I think now in this age of, you know, caution on health and safety and reducing risks and the, you know, the falls risk that's so prevalent in acute care, I just wonder how that practice is going, you know, when we know that early mobilising and getting people out of bed is so important, but how do we counter that with the falls risk? That's a question in there.
That's a question. Look, you know,
you might not have an answer.
Hospital administration, but there's a very successful intervention run through Australia that was published in one of the JAMA journals, I think, earlier this year, called Eat, Walk, Engage, run by physiotherapists primarily out of Queensland, and it was all about early mobilisation as a primary sort of target, because that was their research interest, but also how early immobilisation leads to people able to sort of eat better, drink better, and also engage with other people more so. And they found decreased rates of delirium in their intervention group. So obviously the evidence is there, and I'm sure that they've got health economists working on that, that hopefully can convince people not to be so afraid of the falls risk. But definitely early mobilisation is really key, even if it's just sitting people up. In some cases.
Yeah, such a simple thing. Okay. Now we've got people pretty quiet in the chat room, so I take that as everything that you said was incredibly clear and that they've learned a lot.
Excellent.
I think I've warned you that the chat room is pretty quiet. So my other question is, when you said that 25% of older adults were going to have delirium, what was the definition of older? Was it in the frail age, or was it in the what was the definition of older adult?
Yeah, look, in those meta-analyses, we had to sort of be guided by the various, studies, but usually we use 65 plus as older.
Okay.
Yeah, I should have defined that. That's pretty typical. 65 is older, and then sort of 85 is the oldest old. But of course, as our population longevity increases, those definitions may change too.
Right.
85 doesn't seem that old anymore.
No, my mother's 85, so she's incredibly sprightly. Okay, look, that's fantastic. Thank you both very much, and I'm sure people will be in touch if they've got more questions.